Right, so let's get started. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. Welcome to today's roundtable session on decolonizing anthropological genetics. My name is Maria Nieves Colon. I am a Latina woman with curly black hair, and there is a white background behind me. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I am an affiliated researcher in anthropological genetics with Arizona State University, and I'm also the moderator of today's session. So before we begin, I'd like to caution everyone that this session may include discussion of sensitive topics, including human remains, human bodily tissues, systemic oppression, and racism. So 20 years after the publication of the human genome, advances in DNA sequencing, bioinformatics, and laboratory methods have catalyzed an explosive growth in genetic anthropological research. Today, anthropologists apply molecular methods to answer a wide variety of questions about the human experience, including characterizing the genome of ancient hominins, exploring population histories, understanding the genetic basis of adaptation, and investigating how social experiences become embodied through the epigenome, among others. But despite this growth, anthropological geneticists have only recently begun to reckon with our subfield's colonial origins and its reliance on extractive practices, which can render study participants as unequal subjects, largely excluding them from the knowledge production process while quite literally extracting their DNA or the DNA of their ancestors. Controversies with regards to ancient DNA in particular have raised concerns about the ethics and responsibilities of applying destructive methods to the remains of human ancestors, while also highlighting the need for engaging present-day descendant communities throughout the research process. In addition, the current ubiquity of direct-to-consumer genetic testing and its vast impact on the public imagination compels genetic anthropologists to think about the social implications of DNA and to communicate clearly about what genetic research can and cannot reveal about race, ancestry, identity, and belonging. In recent years, we have seen calls for genetic scientists to critically engage with the social impacts of genetic research by decolonizing and reframing the narratives we tell about DNA. In her foundational text, Decolonizing Methodologies, Linda Tuhiwai-Smith defines decolonization as a process concerned with having a more critical understanding of the underlying assumptions, motivations, and values which inform research practices. For anthropologists, decolonizing our field requires us to engage with the colonial origins of our discipline and to reckon with how this colonial past impacts present-day scientific practice. Specifically, this requires us to recognize the situated nature of scientific inquiry and to rethink how we conceptualize and carry out our studies. It requires us to disrupt long-standing patterns of who can study who and to avoid privileging settler colonial viewpoints over other ways of knowing and understanding our world, our bodies, and our cultures. As my colleague Crystal Sozzi has said before, decolonization requires us to recognize that the questions we ask, the methods that we use, who we choose to include or exclude from our studies, how we interpret our data, and why we invest in some questions but not others, are all value-laden judgments that can perpetuate inequities in the practice of science generally and in anthropology specifically. In addition, as Indigenous scholars have pointed out, decolonization also requires us to work towards unsettling the power structures imposed by settler colonialism, to center the voices and experiences of Indigenous peoples, and to bring about the repatriation of Indigenous land and life. So how can we as genetic anthropologists work towards these goals? What must we do to decolonize our field? In this session on decolonizing anthropological genetics, we will discuss approaches and ideas for creating a more equitable and sustainable anthropological genetics research practice within a decolonization framework. Some of the themes that we will discuss include the ethics and responsibilities of conducting anthropological genetic research with human participants, their remains and tissues, the sovereignty and governance of genetic datasets, community engagement and sustainable collaboration throughout the research process, and the broader responsibilities of genetic anthropologists towards engaging with the social implications of DNA, especially as public interest continues to increase in DNA testing and issues of ancestry and race. To discuss these and other themes, I am honored to introduce our 5 panelists, all of whom engage in scholarship that seeks to decolonize and change the field of anthropological genetics. I will introduce each of our panelists, and then each of them will have 6 to 8 minutes to present their thoughts. Afterwards, we will host an open Q&A discussion with our session attendees. Attendees, you can submit any questions for the panelists in the Q&A box, which is located at the bottom of your screen. There is also a separate chat box available for you to reach out to the AAA tech team for logistical or access support. Please know that presenters will not be able to answer questions submitted in the chat. If you have access needs that preclude you from asking questions in the written Q&A, please use the Zoom raise hand function so that we may unmute you and you may ask your question verbally. Since captioning is provided during this event, I will read the questions out loud to our panelists. And at the end of our session, we ask everyone to join us at the virtual hallway for channel 2 so we can continue our discussion. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Crystal Sozzi. She is a PhD candidate at Vanderbilt University and an investigator with the Native Biodata Consortium. So, Crystal?
Which means hello in the Navajo language. I use she, her, hers as my pronouns. I'm an Indigenous woman with long dark hair, wearing light pink rimmed glasses, and there's a tan background behind me. As mentioned, I am a doctoral student from Vanderbilt University and co-founder of the Native Biodata Consortium. Throughout my work, I use the term Indigenous to describe First Peoples generally and encourage researchers to cease using terms like Amerind or Amerindian, since those terms are closely tied to outdated racial ideologies. I use the term Native American as a political designation for some tribal groups in the US, with acknowledgement that some groups have differences in sovereign status. Ultimately, I urge all communities to I urge all researchers to use the terms that communities designate for themselves to be called out of cultural respect. As anthropologists, I'm sure that you can appreciate the number of ways in which your fields have leveraged many tools to answer the essential questions. Who are we? Where did we come from? Tools which have enabled the insight of population histories and population movements over time. It should be no surprise then that the histories of Indigenous peoples have been one of the most hotly and frequently contested among scholars, especially when you consider the plethora of studies in ancient DNA research involving Indigenous ancestors. But these questions are not being asked by academics alone. Many users of direct-to-consumer test kits are also leveraging genetics to ask the questions, who am I? Where did I come from? Since the market for direct-to-consumer testing was introduced about 7 years ago, over 26.5 million consumers have utilized these genetic tests to determine something about themselves, be it about information about their health risk, biological kinship, or even, sorry, I got distracted for a moment, their genetic ancestry. And in fact, according to Ancestry DNA, which is another popular direct-to-consumer test company, the #1 question asked by test users is, why is my Native American ancestry not showing up? Now, I do not have a lot of time to unpack all of the reasons why falsely conflating biological constructs with Indigenous identity and ancestry are complex. But just know that genetic ancestry estimation, whether from biomarkers collected from ancestors or descendants, have consequences for present-day Indigenous communities, especially for those with colonially defined sovereign status and treaty rights to resources that are closely tied to Indigenous political identities. There have been documented harms in which individuals lacking lineal evidence of Indigenous ancestor misinterpret DNA to claim Indigenous identity, believing that a statistical estimation of Native ancestry could supplant lived experiences, cultural practices, Indigenous kinship relationships, and historic connections to land. Categories of race, ethnicity, and ancestry are not neutral. Indigeneity and kinship are socially and politically defined, and Indigenous people retain the right to define that for themselves. Now, as a population geneticist, I can appreciate that when talking about genetic histories, we have separate tools for assessing genetic ancestry, which is usually modeled about at least 7 to 10 generations back, versus genetic genealogy, which can look at ancestry through more recent kinship structures, such as pedigreed inheritance. But for the most part, the distinction between recent versus distant is arbitrary. This is especially important for Indigenous people. Because we've had such long-lived connections with our elders and ancestral knowledge, stewardship of our ancestors is especially important. And the kinship relationships between ancestors and descendants becomes personal. Indeed, it is this decreased distinction between research on Indigenous ancestors and descendants that is something that I and my co-authors have explored in our recent paper. In attempting to review ancient DNA in the past 2 years, we saw an increased inclusion of contemporary genomes from descendants from clinical and forensic sources, which were combined with data from ancient peoples to explore genetic ancestry, population history, and implications for health. Again, I want to reiterate that effects of research on ancestors are not siloed to non-living people. This research, such as exploring light skin variation, ancient Indigenous peoples, and effects of population reductions due to genocide on adaptive immune function, have implications for Indigenous people living today. We can no longer pretend these research areas are distinct. Lately, there have been efforts by Indigenous scientists and allies to incorporate principles of community-based participatory research to enhance ethical engagement of genomic research in Indigenous communities. These principles outline that for every step of the research process, from determination of aims to dissemination of research and research findings, that the community should be involved. Unfortunately, however, this entails that 1, research is conducted within tribal communities, and 2, that tribes are empowered as sovereign authorities to regulate research, which may not happen even within or outside of the US. Additionally, when we talk about gathering consent from communities for the provenance of biological samples, we do not always consider what happens to the data. Secondary data, data from legacy samples, and data that becomes openly available are outside of community consent and are vulnerable to commercial exploitation by companies seeking to claim intellectual property over Indigenous biomarkers. This is why I'm really glad to announce that we have the Native Biodata Consortium, which attempts to intersect the fields of genomic research, data sovereignty policy, and sustainability with community engagement. We are unique in that we are the first Indigenous-led biological and data repository housed within the tribal jurisdictions, and also employing multidisciplinary multidisciplinary approaches to these questions. And we hope to advance Indigenous data genomic sovereignties in the space of genomics, and also conduct culturally and bioethically consistent research with Indigenous people's needs and interests centered. Thank you. Ahiahat. This is our website.
Thank you, Crystal. Now we're going to hear from Rick Smith. Rick is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology and Women and Gender Studies at George Mason University and is a research affiliate with the Indigenous STS Laboratory. Rick?
Hi, thanks for that introduction. So first, I just want to thank the organizers and Maria Nieves Colon and Augustine Fuentes and the AAA organizing community who made this event possible. And I want to say hello and thank you to my co-panelists here for their sustained interventions in these questions that we're discussing today. So I would like to make just a few brief comments in concert with what others have offered here so far and what will be offered throughout the course of this conversation about decolonization and anthropological genomics. So first, as a non-Indigenous scholar, it is not ultimately up to me to decide what decolonization means. So my focus here today is going to be on how I'm working at the intersections of feminist, queer, and Indigenous theories of power to take on the Genome Lab as a site that's in need of political and epistemological transformation. That is to say that my work is in relation to multiple sustained critiques of colonialism, with the goal of bringing about a transformation of science that serves the interests of Indigenous peoples, as well as other marginalized communities who suffer within the social conditions of the colony. So the first thing I would like to do is to think about how far the framework of decolonization as a working theory has traveled to reach us here in this gathering today, and how we have often seen its usage in science, I think, get stripped of some of its more radical potential. So with this in mind, I want to heed Eve Tuck and Kei Wang Yang's reminder about what is unsettling about decolonization. That is to say that it's not simply a metaphor. It's not just another tool to improve our societies or our existing institutions, but decolonization in this definition should ultimately bring about the repatriation of Indigenous life and land. The question then is, what does this mean for genomics? And that's the question that I'm going to try to focus some of my thinking here today. So first, thinking about how decolonization is not always commensurate with other justice movements, i.e. Tuck and Yang that I just mentioned, it's important to consider how the goals of decolonization and the histories of bioethics and science justice may or may not always be aligned. Decolonization and bioethical approaches in genomics are often used interchangeably, or they're often seen as kind of operating in tandem, but there are important distinctions between the two that I think are important to name clearly. Broadly speaking, bioethics is a set of interventions aimed at scientific betterment that are rooted within and in response to the history of biology and medicine. The goals of bioethics are not always epistemological, and they're not always existential in their scope, meaning that they don't always represent a fundamental questioning of science as a form of knowledge production. The goal certainly is to minimize harm in that the process of scientific knowledge, or in that process of scientific knowledge production. But for bioethics, I think there's often a future in which some form of Western science is still with us, that the fundamental principles and structures of scientific knowledge production can be salvaged if only we can make them less violent. The question for me is, where are the terms of this debate being set here? Do they find themselves rooted in the history of science and medicine? Or do they locate themselves in prioritizing Indigenous and other peoples who have been disproportionately impacted by scientific violence, as communities who should be setting the priorities and value systems through which we ought to proceed? So this is all not to deny that there are meaningful points of connection between bioethics and decolonization, as I'm sure there are. But I think it's important to take Tuck and Yang very seriously and not simply assume that all science justice movements are fully aligned with the goal of repatriating Indigenous life and land. So when we think about what decolonization means in anthropological genomics, for me, this is more of an existential question than what we tend to think about in the context of bioethics. That is to say that I don't think we're going to simply good guy our way out of this and leave the pillars of the foundation of science intact. Personally, I hope for something more transformative than that. I think the history of science and the history of colonialism are clearly intertwined and inseparable. And so the presumed authority of Western scientists and scientific subjects to set the conditions of what gets counted as legitimate knowledge about nature and the body has always been core to dehumanization and dispossession of Indigenous people and many other subjects of European imperialism. So because of this, I think to pull out the colonialism from science, I think is also to deal this lethal blow to scientific knowledge production as we now understand it. In Custer Died for Your Sins, Vine Deloria Jr. explained how anthropologists often work to redefine Indigenous peoples in terms that white men will accept and that are in contravention to Indigenous sovereignty. In the context of genomics, that process of redefinition continues to this day, although the technologies through which it proceeds have somewhat shifted, as Crystal Sosi just pointed out. Kim Tallbear, Jessica Kolopenek, Crystal, and many of my other colleagues on this panel and beyond have forcefully critiqued the use of genetic ancestry testing in privileging settler definitions of race and biological kinship over the sovereignty of Indigenous peoples to define themselves and determine their rightful members. So I want to point out that this isn't just a problem for genetic ancestry testing, but it's a problem for the entire history of genomics that set the conditions of possibility for all this to take place in the first place. So it's been said many times, but I think bears repeating here. Genome science has long operated in tandem with settler colonialism in imagining the demise of biologically defined Indigenous peoples, and simultaneously imagining this future for settlers who carry fragments of these so-called Native American DNA, in making them the kind of rightful heirs of this land, the inheritors of this land in a biological sense. No one who does this work in genomics stands outside of that history. And for me, this raises really challenging and complicated questions about what decolonization means in practice when there can be no outside of colonial power in the genome lab as we now know it. So in coming back to Tuck and Yang and in working at the intersection of Indigenous STS and genomics, the questions are not only about creating more equitable relations in genomics, although it does include that, but also to destabilize the very position of Western science and scientists, whomever they may be, as the sole arbiters of knowledge about bodies and nature. This is, of course, not to deny genomics as a source of meaningful knowledge about the world, but to question and reconfigure the structures of knowledge in which it proceeds, and to bring it alongside other capacities for knowledge production. I honestly wonder, I often wonder what we're left with when we pull the colonialism out of genomics, and I think it's important to consider the possibilities that what we get may be unrecognizable. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. Next, we will hear from Chip Caldwell. Chip is editor-in-chief of Sapiens and was the former senior curator of anthropology at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science.
Great, thank you very much. Hello, my name is Chip Caldwell. I use he, him. I am a white man with close cropped hair and a beard, and I'm wearing a black shirt. I'm in an office with bookshelves and a couch behind me. And I'm an anthropological archaeologist and the editor-in-chief at sapiens.org. I'm in Denver, Colorado, and would like to recognize that my home state here is the traditional lands of 48 tribes in the Great Plains, Great Basin, and American Southwest. In the brief time allotted me for this introductory period of the panel, I would just like to briefly introduce a project that I've been working on for the last year. The title of the project is The Ethics of Studying Indigenous North American Ancient DNA, Moving from Theories to Practice. This is a project that's being funded by the National Science Foundation, and we hope to have it completed in early or mid 2022. I'm just one of 7 co-PIs. We have an amazing postdoc, and there are some 40 plus representatives from tribal, genomic, archaeological, and museological perspectives. I think many who are listening into this panel are familiar with the explosion of ancient DNA research in the last decade. Just 10 years ago, there were only a handful of ancient genomes that have been sequenced, and now every year there are thousands of ancient genomes that are being sequenced. And so even though there has been these gigantic technological leaps in the discipline, there has been a much slower engagement around issues of the ethics, legality, and social implications of this research. So this NSF-funded project that I'm working on seeks to understand how Indigenous and scientific communities perceive and participate in this research, ultimately with the goal to improve relationships between these different communities and ideally to foster more ethical engagements. There's really just two key elements, two key parts to this project. The first is trying to understand what the current ethical landscape looks like. And we're approaching this through 3 different methods. The first is online surveys. We are currently conducting an online survey of geneticists and scientists who are working on paleogenomics. And I'm actually going to put that survey in the chat box. That's only open for another week. So please do help us and help our project by completing that survey if you'd like and have the time for it. So we are doing a survey of the geneticist community, and then we're going to be doing a survey of Indigenous community leaders. Second, we are looking at a series of case studies of how ancient DNA has played out in different spheres. And then we are doing ethnographic research, which has been interrupted quite a bit by the pandemic. And so instead of going to different Indigenous communities and labs around the world, we have been doing online telephone and Zoom interviews instead. The idea is once we get a kind of grounding in the current ethical landscape, we then want to pull in different communities to have a conversation about, given where we're at now, what might a new future look like? And so we plan to hold a series of workshops. Again, they were going to be in person, probably now mostly online, but we'll have a series of workshops where we might be working towards either a set of principles, a set of best practices, this kind of TBD of what it will look like as a product. But the idea is that these conversations lead us in a new direction or a different direction in which all these different communities that have a stake in ancient DNA research have the ability to empower themselves with different resources so that there is more so that there's deeper conversations around the ethics of this work. All of this will be published, of course, through both popular and academic writings. And then we have the web domain adnaethics.org. You can go there now to get just an overview of the project. But by the end of the project, the idea is to have a whole array of resources for different community members. So if you are maybe a brand new graduate student and you're working in a lab that has never perhaps done community-based work, you'll have a suite of resources available to you to learn about how to do that. Or perhaps you are in a tribal community and maybe work in a cultural preservation office and you're approached by a lab that says, we want to work in your community. Where to start? What does that look like? What are good models? The website ideally would provide those resources as well. So in the end, we want to have a project that understands where we're at now, but also lays the groundwork for a new and different kind of future. So with that, I'll pass the baton and look forward to the discussion with all the panelists. So thank you.
Thank you, Chip. Now we're going to hear from Jennifer Wagner. Jennifer is the Associate Director of Bioethics Research and Assistant Professor at the Geisinger Center for Translational Bioethics and Healthcare Policy.
Thank you. It's great to be here with this tremendous panel. Hello, my name is Jen Wagner. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I'm a white woman with a navy blue shirt, blue eyes, and a headscarf. The background is a pretty boring white office. I'm an attorney as well as an assistant professor at Geisinger's Center for Translational Bioethics and Healthcare Policy, and previously served as the American Society of Human Genetics Social Issues Committee chair. And during that time, I helped work with some individuals on this panel to help develop its recent practical guidance on fostering responsible ancient DNA research. Now, throughout my work, I have been, some might say, all over the place, given my background in anthropology, genetics, law, and policy. But what has really served as an underpinning for everything that I have done, regardless of context, is this notion of equity. And my commitment to advancing the international human right to science. And it's from that perspective that I'm going to talk to you just about a couple of things that I think are relevant from an industry or practical perspective, less of an academic perspective as it relates to decolonizing anthropological genetics. So, some of my work has focused on direct-to-consumer testing, at least the work that I did prior to joining Geisinger. But at Geisinger, my work has really focused on precision health, or the genetic technologies, mobile health technologies, and their application to improve our understanding of health and disease. And from that perspective, I've been doing some work related to patient engagement, patient-centeredness, or research participant-centeredness, and also trying to emphasize the role of community engagement, family engagement, as well as the individual consent that might underpin traditional research. So I want to turn back to this international human right to science. So we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was adopted in 1948, and it included this right that everyone has the right freely to participate in and to share in scientific advancements and its benefits. And what does that mean? It hasn't always been so clear. And it involves both the right to participate in science, and that's not just as a participant from whom data and specimens are collected, but also as scientists. So thinking about decolonizing anthropological genetics, from my perspective, involves both prongs, right? It involves making sure that we have science that's created by and for people that it's intended to benefit. And then also this right to enjoy the benefits of science, which in my mind involves making sure that the distribution of benefits and harms are equitable. So recently, in April of this year, we actually have a new framework that was adopted by the United Nations Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. It's known as General Comment 25, which is really a framework to try to articulate what exactly is involved in this international human right to science. And the committee explained several elements of this right, including availability or conservation, accessibility, which would include inclusion and freedom from discrimination, quality and acceptability. And it also provided a reminder of states' obligations, that is to say, nation or country obligations, to respect, protect, and fulfill that international human right. And then the general comment went on to provide quite a bit of information of special emphasis on matters related to participation and transparency, the precautionary principle that some of you might know from bioethics, as well as issues related to how this human right, like other human rights, are interrelated. They're interdependent, and in the committee's and standard human rights language, the right to science is intrinsic, but also instrumental in that it's foundational to these other rights, like the right to health, among others. So from my vantage point at Geisinger and with precision health research, in practice, I'm seeing data disparities. I'm seeing the exacerbation of inequalities. I'm seeing emerging vulnerable populations, which I would refer to as quote unquote data rich or data poor individuals and groups. And these disparities are varying across different societal sectors. So what we see is this very clear, unfair distribution and unequal distribution of benefits and burdens of genetic technologies and these scientific and technological advances. So in the United States, if we consider for a moment the unequal distribution and its representation in biomedical and law enforcement genetic databases, you can think about the healthcare context wherein the data poor experience relatively lower quality of healthcare and worse health outcomes. And in the law enforcement context, you see the data poor experience is actually manifested as relatively greater liberties and freedom from unreasonable searches and seizures. So when there are disproportionate representations in biomedical and law enforcement databases, just as two examples, the data injustices come to light. So we have racial and ethnic minorities often being treated simultaneously as preferred guinea pigs and scapegoats for the ills, both literally and figuratively, of society. And I am deeply troubled by this. So a lot of my work has included commentaries where I'm very critical of practices. And I want to emphasize some possible options, right? To think about this is equitable selection and treatment of research participants. So it's something that people learn as part of responsible conduct of research, but we need to think about both the fair and equitable selection of participants, so opportunities to participate, and opportunities that don't overly burden an already marginalized group of people, as well as fair and equitable treatment of those individuals. So in the context of data rich and data poor disparities that I'm seeing emerge, we have dissimilar treatment of the data rich and data poor. And what I mean by that is scientists are increasingly valuing the participation of data rich individuals to the neglect of opportunities to the data poor. And of course, this must be balanced with realistic and responsible distribution of research resources. But it's something that I find quite troubling. And this data wealth of participants is not, in my opinion, a sufficient justification for example, unequal payment or compensation for research participation. And in policy, I think with the move towards precision health and precision medicine, there's come this intentionality to break down data silos, to utilize data from very diverse sources in the hopes of finding the quote unquote needles in a haystack through technological solutions. Yet in the United States, as an example, most of our data governance policies remain very sector specific, and the laws and policies and regulations are beginning to break down in terms of effectiveness. So the civil rights mechanisms of the 1960s and 70s to ensure fairness at the precise time, they're breaking down at the precise time at which we need them perhaps the most. And so this comes with a simultaneous need to recognize, distinctions in the ethics community and the ethics approach between an over-reliance on autonomy and thinking about individualism as the end all of what we need to focus on in biomedical ethics. And I think we really need to start seeing a recalibration that focuses more on that justice principle. So it's worth noting again, this international human right to science was embodied in the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a document that Eleanor Roosevelt and the United States helped draft, help lead. And while this right was later articulated in Article 15 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which the United States signed in 1977, the United States has never ratified that treaty. And the United States in recent years has been thumbing its nose at the international human rights obligations it has in recent years. So this includes its obligations under the International Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, which was finally ratified by the United States in 1994. And the United States has embarrassingly failed to even submit its party report on that treaty, and that's overdue by more than 3 years. So in many ways, we need to rethink or renew this idea of thinking globally and acting locally and demanding more from the United States when it comes to decolonizing science generally and anthropological genetics specifically. And we must find a way to unify. We need to find a way to stand in solidarity against policies and practices that really undermine the ability to respect protect, and fulfill this right to science within the United States and beyond. So part of my work has been to try to draw attention to the need to modernize our law and policy as it relates to privacy and anti-discrimination, and also to think about the ways in which we envision equitable treatment of individuals, regardless of context, with regard to these scientific advancements and technologies. And I think, you know, I'm looking forward to the discussion so that we can get into what this might mean, but the ways in which the United States government handles DNA, handles genetic information, has ramifications for what happens by the individual private sector or research that could actually bring about benefits that then could be distributed. So I have concerns about viewing this from one vantage point without recognizing the way in which all of these areas of society relate with one another. So I think I'll end there because I look forward to the next speaker's talk.
Thank you, Jen. Last but certainly not least, we will hear from Keolu Fox, who is an assistant professor at the University of California, San Diego, and an affiliate with the Indigenous Futures Lab.
Yes, thank you so much, Maria, and to all the organizers for putting this on. This is well needed, timely, and it is just such an honor and privilege to get to talk about some of my work and kind of connect it and recombine it with colleagues that I'm just privileged to know. So I will begin by saying that my preferred pronouns are doctor and professor, and that I am a native Hawaiian man, and I have ehu colored hair, and it's curly. And I will begin by sharing my screen. And here we go. Thank you so much again. I'm going to kind of center the majority of these comments around this emerging, exciting, empowering field of Indigenous data sovereignty. And I wanted to kind of harken back to the kind of history of the Human Genome Project itself. Starting in 2001, we have President then Clinton and Francis Collins and others debuting the Human Genome Project. And at the time, the #1 resource or commodity on planet Earth was, valued, was oil. And then we have the introduction of the Precision Medicine Initiative, which would then be rebranded as the All of Us program, which is a large-scale government initiative to sequence 1 million people's genomes in the United States of America. Now, this transition from 1 genome to 1 million genomes is a pretty incredible scientific achievement. And in the process, though, big data, raw data, has surpassed oil as the #1 resource on planet Earth in 2018. That is not reflected in the way that we sort of problem solve and think about data as a resource. And you can see this famous article that was published in the Economist saying the world's most valuable resource is no longer oil, but it's data itself. And that includes digital sequence information derived from human genomes. And that information can be used to do a number of things. And we're going to talk about kind of briefly what some of the consequences, promises, perils, and processes around this data are. But this article was published recently in the New York Times, and it's talking about how China uses DNA to track its people with the help of American expertise. And investigators that have been involved in the pursuit of human genetic variation-based studies and kind of filling in this whole spectrum of human genetic variation, aided and abetted in this process, and how this information has now been integrated in all kinds of surveillance systems. And that includes facial recognition prediction technology, machine learning and deep learning algorithms to actually put a whole ethnic group on what I would call house arrest. They are basically this information, this digital sequence information derived from these genomes has been used to support efforts of genocide for a Muslim ethnic group, the Uyghurs. And this is not the type of future that we need to uphold, promote, or support. In that sense, though, we have to think about some of the characters that were involved in this unsavory activity of sharing that data, sharing this indigenous data with these large kind of federally recognized countries. And one of those individuals is Ken Kidd, and he is the Yale geneticist that provided this data. Whether it's unintended or not, we're not thinking about what the unintended consequences of the use and utilization of digital sequence information from indigenous groups are. And it's not just a cautionary tale, it's a reality for a whole ethnic group. And I don't think we're having frank enough conversations about what this means and who the characters are that just get slapped on the wrist for this type of behavior. That's why indigenous data sovereignty is so important. This new field focusing on controlling interests in data, including digital sequence information. How do we recognize indigenous rights and human rights and interest in raw data and DSI within an open data or open sharing environment? How do we share this data and collaborate around ethical access and use in ways that are consistent with existing community protocols? And finally, something that has become a very new and emerging interest in my laboratory and the Indigenous Futures Lab at UCSD is how do we negotiate equitable outcomes from DSI, including potential for commercialization and commodification? We've published a number of different papers on this, but I think it's really important to look at the facts. Regeneron, for example, knows that geographically sequestered populations of people are going to have genetic mutations that are geographically sort of private and rare, but they're common amongst certain populations. And those types of mutations can lead to expediting large-scale pharmaceutical drugs and blockbuster drugs. And there's precedent for already for this. And many of these mutations have already been used to create new classes of cholesterol drugs like PCSK9 inhibitors that were derived from genome sequence data from African and African American individuals. So the question is, who is actually benefiting from this? Are the populations of people that this information was derived from directly benefiting from this, or is it only a handful of extractive capitalists? And I think you know where I'm going with this, but we need to prevent the development of $300,000 drugs. Here's another example of how Vertex actually created a partnership with the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. And they asked them if they could, one, acquire financial support, and two, also recruit and engage patients that have cystic fibrosis to utilize specific genetic mutations that allowed them to refine the development of biomarkers and create a new class of cystic fibrosis drugs. They then sold that drug back to those exact same patients for $300,000 a year. Now, I don't know about you, but that's not the type of country I want to live in. Certainly not one where it estimates between 30 and 60 million people don't have healthcare coverage. So we need to stop, recalibrate, and ask real questions about what's happening with genome sequence data, who is it actually benefiting, and how we can support the least, the last, the looked over, and the left out, the communities that need this the most. And there are a number of really interesting options. One of them is called benefit sharing. This is supported by the Nagoya Protocol in the UN, and this is used in a bunch of different agricultural settings in various places in Southern Africa, including with direct engagement of the San and the Khoi communities and looking at rooibos tea profits that are shared. We need to think about more creative ways to utilize circular economic ecosystems to redistribute profits and proceeds that are developed from extractive processes like agriculture, and probably the most extractive process of all, physically mining soil for diamonds. And there's a great story that was published in the New Yorker, and they were looking at just this in Botswana, where 5 to 10% of proceeds from diamond mining go directly back to the federal government in a circular economic modality, which allows for the development and support of cultural revitalization programs, education programs, healthcare programs. You get the picture. We're talking about support and benefit sharing to build infrastructure for communities. This is something that I highlighted in a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine, where we're thinking about approaches to equitable benefit sharing so that digital sequence information derived from something like the NIH's All of Us program doesn't just get taken across the goal line by companies like Regeneron, that we can establish new methods and ways that are rooted in indigenous data sovereignty to establish collective interest models or individual interest models that result in equitable benefit sharing. And finally, today, actually, our correspondence, or my correspondence with the All of Us program, was published again in the New England Journal of Medicine. And I just wanted to highlight one of the paragraphs from that where I'm saying genomic data is a resource. We need to start acting like that. But unless we approach the use of genomic data more sustainably, we risk deepening existing health and economic disparities under the guise of inclusion. This is the illusion of inclusion that everybody is critically discussing. I envision a future in which the innovations of precision medicine benefit the communities that made that innovation possible. We will need more than diverse data to get there. And I truly believe that, and I think that it is in context of what's going on in this whole age of surveillance capitalism and the way that raw data is getting embedded into all of these different economic ecosystems. I recommend everyone read this book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff. It's excellent. And with that, I will take questions and look forward to our panel discussion. Malo.
Thank you, Keolu. I hope everybody can see me. Yes. Okay. So thank you everyone for your interventions. I already feel like I learned a lot. I'm going to open the floor to questions, or this channel to questions. And we have a question already from Francisco Vergara. And he's asking, is it possible to attain a consensus view on what decolonization could or should mean, given the diverse colonization trajectories that different regions have gone through, especially outside of America or North America? And I'd like to open that or pose that question for the panel.
I can share some thoughts if no one else is going to. And I would just say, I'm not sure that consensus is really what we're after. I think maybe consensus in a process in terms of making sure people are thinking critically and carefully about various considerations would be the way to get there. But it's always going to be context dependent. So I think it's more about having people move from, I think I wrote previously in a publication, from codes to consciousness, right? So not just doing what is required by a code of ethics or the letter of a law, but going beyond there and really internalizing the issues that are at play for that particular context, and making sure that you're consulting and engaging those who should be involved in decision-making processes in that particular context.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think colonialism historically has played out unevenly and intentionally so. It's about the extraction of resources from particular groups for the benefit of other groups. So that's always going to have, very particular historical trajectories in different places and uneven power structures. So I think to undo that and address it, it's necessarily local, even though there can be this overarching goal of reshaping what that landscape looks like.
Could I add something? Sorry, I was having I completely just agree with both what you guys are saying. I was having a conversation with one of my colleagues. We have an anthropological audience, and so all of us kind of exist in anthropology departments. Mine's more global health oriented, for what it's worth. But I was thinking about it, and we had this conversation, like anthropology is shifting from this kind of assessment of the variation in culture now to really, really being focused on power. And I think like the more we tell students that that's the case, then the more they'll be activated and have agency to actually make a difference in those spaces. But I thought it was kind of like, it's a profound idea, not for people from our generation, but for, you know, for the previous kind of iteration of the way people are trained in these spaces.
Okay, so we have 5 minutes left. So in the 5 minutes that we have left, I wanted to read out Anna Gretel's question, which is, she wanted to ask about texts that may be understood as basic or fundamental to think about, as at the possible intersection between biological anthropology, bioethics, and decolonization. If anyone has some quick suggestions of where people can continue to read and learn about this topic, we have 4 minutes.
Oh, I forget who mentioned Auntie Linda's book, but that's the one.
I think
You
you're
did, right?
muted.
Oh, you did in the beginning, right?
Yeah.
That's the one. That's like,
Yeah, sure. And for thinking about how this relates specifically to the issue of genome science, I think Kim Tallbear's 2013 book, Native American DNA and the False Promise of Genome Science, is may not be getting that title totally fully right, but I think that book is one of the standard bearers for how to think about the ways these issues are integrating in the field of genomics.
Wonderful. So I'd like to start to wrap up our session and invite our attendees to join us in virtual hallway number 2. To do so, go to day 1, virtual hallway 2, and click join live. Some of us will be there and we can continue to have some virtual conversations on this topic. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for joining and for providing their thoughts and perspectives. I myself feel like I learned a whole lot just organizing this session, and I think all of our attendees also probably learned some new ways of thinking about this issue. And thank you to the AAA for organizing this event, to Mayanti for inviting us to put this together, and to all of you for joining. So thank you.
hey, how do I go to the hallway? What's
I
going
will
on?
post I'm going to post the link in the chat so that everybody can see it. And it's optional, but might as well join and have some more conversations. Thank you so much, everyone. And I hope you have a good afternoon.
Thank you so much,
The
Maria.
main event program, you'll just find virtual hallway and you can join live anytime. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Maria.
Yep.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Lovely to see your faces.